If I seem a bit distracted or dumpy or weird in this video, it's because I've got a new lighting setup and it's weirding me out. So today I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between kind of self-development and self-exploration and spirituality, but more specifically, I want to talk a bit about the expectations that we set up around change and evolution and development and always pushing forward, as opposed to maybe finding a more kind of stable grounding setup, something that we can fall back on at time and time again. So the question of spiritual practice versus self-development is something that I've come back to on and off over the years. I've made a couple of videos dedicated to this. One in particular I made maybe a year or two ago, and I'll link that somewhere obvious for you guys to find. And on that, well, in that video I was really kind of going into quite a lot of depth about my thoughts at the time on the relationship between the two, why we in the kind of alternative spirituality community, why we tend to combine the two, link the two, and how that has evolved for me over time. Because quite a few years ago, a few years before that, I went through a phase of feeling like I wanted to separate the two things. I felt like I wanted to have space in my life for self-exploration and using tarot and that kind of thing, and kind of being more healthy and just, you know, physically and mentally and emotionally kind of self-development. And then on the other hand, I wanted to have a separate component to my life that was about devotion and reverence and worship and that kind of thing. And then, you know, in that last video that I made a couple of years ago, I was more wanting to bring the two things back together, because I was seeing how, I think at the end of the day, when it's a kind of a very self-made, self-oriented practice, when we're not practicing in a group, when it's really just something that we're doing ourselves in our own time, the two things really just do marry together, and it makes a lot of sense for the two to be kind of interplaying with one another. But if you want more on that, that I would suggest watching that video that I made previously. But yeah, today I was really just thinking about, in terms of that kind of relationship between the two things, I was really just thinking about how there is this tendency in, I mean, it's not just in the alternative spiritual community, it's in the much wider kind of holistic community, alternative health, and just, it's a really wide, broad area of sort of well-being and wellness, where there is this focus on the individual doing things for themselves, to improve themselves, to better themselves. And I think all of those different practices that fall under that umbrella, they definitely are interrelated. And I think that various forms of paganism are kind of more or less similar to some of those. I think there are some very quote-unquote secular versions of that kind of wellness theme. So, you know, people who might do yoga and might even meditate and do things like that, but they don't actually necessarily think of it as being particularly spiritual or to do with divinity or anything like that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have pagans or witches or Wiccans or all sorts of other types of people who actually have very quite structured, more religious looking practices, and that are really often quite not very focused on the development of the individual kind of self, and that they're more focused on the gods or on nature or what have you. But I think a lot of us fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum between those two things. I think I know that I do, and I know that a lot of you who are watching me, that you fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. And it's been interesting for me as I go along to think about that and to assess what it is that I feel like I'm doing in my practice, and what it is that I'm focusing on, and whether I'm comfortable with that, and are there other elements that I want to bring into play. But specifically then today, I was thinking about how that kind of attitude, that kind of paradigm that we're all sitting inside of, it actually can be putting us under quite a lot of pressure. I think we can just put ourselves under a lot of undue pressure to be constantly in flux and constantly improving ourselves, constantly moving forward. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I completely understand why we want to do that, because as humans, we're never fully satisfied. There are always things that we would wish to change about ourselves, that ways in which we are making ourselves unhappy, or that we're unhappy with our life circumstances. There are always things that we wish that we had the time to do, that we were making the time to do, that we're not. And I think it's quite natural for us to always be looking for outlets in our lives to kind of try and bring that change, that positive change that we're looking for into being, trying to bring it into play. And I think that because there is this connection between the kind of wellness themes and the wellness paradigm and the more explicitly religious, pagan kind of spheres, it makes a lot of sense to us, or it just kind of happens naturally for us that we let the two kind of leak in together, and that kind of sense of using certain techniques and certain habits as a way of pushing ourselves forward and just paying attention to our own behavior and trying to keep ourselves accountable to the things that we want to do, or the ways that we want to be. Like, it makes sense that leaks into our religious practice. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that we do feel a certain amount of pressure to be improving ourselves or moving in a certain direction, because I think we are always at our happiest when we feel like we are making progress in some way. That we are at our happiest when we have goals that we feel like we're taking steps towards. And I think keeping ourselves accountable in that regard and being conscious and aware of that is definitely a good thing. But I think there's also a lot to be said for not putting ourselves under so much pressure. And the first way that I really wanted to talk about this was in terms of spiritual practice. So I know I've probably talked about this quite a lot on and off on the channel about how I have felt pressure myself to always be kind of doing new things with spiritual practice and ritual, and feeling pressured or pressurizing myself and feeling like I've let myself down if I'm not kind of constructing a brand new ritual every time a Sabbath comes around, and just constantly exploring new avenues and doing new things and updating it and everything. And I think, if you get a lot of joy out of that, then that's a wonderful thing to have in your life. But over the years, I have definitely learned that there's a lot to be said for having a fallback, for having a structure that works, a simple ritual structure, a simple thing that I do, that you might want to do, that that if all else fails, if you have had no time to think about what it is you want to do to mark a certain occasion, that this is what you do. This is the thing that works for you, that is meaningful, that you can sit down and print off a ritual script from your computer. That's what I do, or even I just use my phone to follow along, because I won't necessarily remember all of the words, and I'm not as on top of my ritual practice as I used to be, maybe. So I used to have all of these things memorized, and I don't necessarily have them memorized anymore. It's not perfect, and that's okay. And I have found it to be very kind of spiritually healing, like healing of my attitude towards my own spirituality, to allow myself just to fall back on this kind of basic ritual structure, and on a much simpler, pared down ritual in the last kind of year or so. And I've really just found that allowing myself to do that will often give me the space I need to actually have other experiences in sacred space, but also maybe not. And sometimes it's okay to just check back in with something that you've made earlier, something that you have previously found to be meaningful, something that you've written or constructed at a time when you had the space and time in your life to be thinking about it, to be constructing a ritual. I think falling back on that is not a negative thing. It doesn't mean that you're stagnating necessarily if you're falling back on old habits. I think there can be something really powerful in repetition and in going back to that same structure and that same ritual and those same words of power over and over again. And kind of directly related to that, I would say, is my realization that if I don't feel like doing a particular form of ritual, or if I just don't feel like doing something energetic, I don't have to, or something creative in sacred space, I don't have to. And sometimes we need to allow ourselves to actually just do the thing that we most feel like doing. I mean, if the Sabbath comes around and you really just don't want to do any kind of ritual, and all you want to do is pour yourself a glass of wine and sit in a candlelit room and journal or not journal, or just think or talk out loud, then do it, absolutely do it. Like, nobody's watching. There's no pressure on you to do any specific thing. And I think that the more we allow ourselves to actually lean into what it is we are actually feeling drawn to do in the moment, the more we actually open ourselves up to being able to tap into those feelings of reverence and awe when we want to, when we wish to, when we have the space and time, and when we want to make that space and time. I've definitely found that to be the case, that I will have the most meaningful, reverential experiences when I actually sit and think to myself, is doing ritual really what's going to be best for you right now in this moment? Is it actually what you feel like doing? Are you feeling drawn to it? Now I've talked a bit about altar spaces and how if you're not feeling drawn to your altar, that might mean that you need to change it up. I made a video about spiritual slumps, and I think I talked a bit about altars there, and I also made a video where I was changing up my altar. I'll link those videos somewhere as well for you. So if you're not feeling drawn to your altar, then maybe that's something that needs to be changed up and freshened up, but also maybe you're just not being drawn to your altar, and that's okay. And I think finally I really just wanted to expand this out to kind of the creative endeavors in general, your kind of creative life. And how I realized recently that I go through phases of beating myself up for not doing specific things. So for example, for not doing enough creative writing, for not working on my novel, for not doing specific things. And it's only in hindsight that, or when I actually give myself the time to sit and think about it, that I realise, well, you know, I've actually been playing a lot of guitar and I've been writing lots of songs, or, you know, I've been exploring my creativity in other ways. And for example, I had a realisation yesterday that writing is something that I have stepped back from a lot in recent years. I have not been blogging, I have not been doing a lot of creative writing, but what I have been doing is vocalizing and verbalizing. I've been making more YouTube videos than I have blog posts. I have, instead of journaling, I've been making audio files for myself. I've been sending out audio files for the newsletter instead of writing. And I have been writing songs instead of writing and singing songs instead of writing fiction. And I thought that was really interesting, and I think it's probably because I'm kind of oversaturated with writing when it comes to academia. And I just thought, well, what a beautiful thing. If those are the things that I feel naturally drawn to do, then why not do them? Isn't that kind of the whole point of the creative endeavour? To just do what you feel drawn to, express yourself in the moment. And yeah, I think going forward, I really want to start allowing myself to do that more, and not shaming myself for not doing the things that I feel like I'm supposed to be doing because I'm a writer. And you know, at the end of the day, I am writing, I'm just writing other stuff right now, and that's okay. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I'm sure I'll be talking about this topic again. I definitely am going to have much more to talk about in terms of the exploration of the self and self-development and spirituality, and how the two things come into play. And I think I'd like to maybe start talking on the channel a little bit more about creative endeavors and creativity, and how we engage with our creativity and our creative expression and so on as well. So yeah, we'll see if that might become a thing in the future. But I hope you all had a wonderful Beltane or Bealtaine if you are in the Northern Hemisphere, or a wonderful Samhain if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. I had a really lovely evening, and I hope you did too. Or maybe you're celebrating today. I don't know when exactly you might be doing your thing. But yeah, I hope you all had a great time. I will be sending out a newsletter, I hope, sometime around the time that I'm putting out this video. And yeah, I'll be talking to you again next week. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to subscribe and like this video, and do comment. I can be slow to reply to comments, but I do endeavour to eventually get around to replying to the more recent comments, at least on the videos, or at least I definitely read them all at some stage. So yeah, talk to you again soon, guys.